foreign policy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, Ravi, from your perch, given how the American presidential elections are shaping up, are you now veering around to the inevitability of a Joe Biden versus Trump presidential contest in November?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as close to inevitable as it gets. It would take a dramatic turnaround in the courts for Trump to not be the candidate. Joe Biden obviously is the candidate. It's unlikely that anyone would challenge him at this stage. So, given that we're looking at Biden-Trump 2.0, I think it's time now for the world to try and understand what either side means for them, whether it's India, whether it's Europe. And there are a lot of big ticket issues, I think, that are on the table from a global sense. Americans, of course, will vote on largely pocketbook issues. And remember, again, many Americans, given how polarized America is, they already have a strong sense of which way they want to go. So a lot depends on turnout. But if you're in the rest of the world, you're going to worry about the future of multilateralism. You're going to worry about how America engages with the world. If you're in Europe, you're going to worry about America's support for Ukraine. You're going to worry about how America might treat China, whether there will be a change, whether Trump 2.0 will be unleashed in a different way. So those are all concerns, I think, that the rest of the world is going to be thinking about very deeply.
Candidate Trump so far has seemed more calibrated and balanced than the mercurial Trump we saw first time around. Is that just a facade, or could this be the new Trump? Because his advisors seem to suggest that he's a changed man. Is that even possible?
I'm not so sure that I would say he's calibrated. He has said on the campaign trail that he will go after people who didn't support him or weren't loyal to him. He's said all kinds of things that would worry any supporters of democracy in the United States, any supporters of the rule of law. I think it's immensely worrying. It's not just whether you're red or blue, Republican or Democrat. A return of Trump would prove to Americans and the world that his 4 years weren't a blip, that the chaos and the sense of vengeance is very real. I think he has been very clear that he would go after a lot of people, that a second term would be the term where he now knows exactly what to do. He would be unleashed in a sense. There's a lot to worry there.
Samir, what could President Trump mean for India and for the world in your view, if it does come down to that?
Rahul, I think first, before I respond to that particular question and try to warm myself up in this freezing temperature, let me just, observe something from what Ravi just mentioned. In any other part of the world, if you had the developments that you've seen in America in the last 6 to 8 months, cases being filed against the opposition candidate making outrageous statements and literally abusing everyone and every region of the world at some point, you would have said this is a nutcase democracy, this is a sham, this is not democracy, right? Can you imagine in any other part of the world an opposition candidate having 20 cases filed against him in the year when you're campaigning, and America saying, oh no, fine, it's...
And so calling for insurrection.
And calling for insurrection. Look, it's a spectacle rather than a democratic process right now in the US. And none of us should be, taking this lightly. I think it forebodes a number of issues. The most important is the durability of America to remain a viable and influential actor in the world affairs in the future. I think that's the first big thing we all have to realize, that a world without a rational, strong, sensible, influential America is upon us, and we have to start looking at plan Bs. All of us have to start thinking about it. So I think what this election tells us is that we need plan B, and I think that is my response to you. Now my response to you is that there are 3 sets of countries, many more, but 3 sets of countries in terms of how they are assessing the elections as we go forward. First, many who rely on America for security, for their economics, for their relevance, are worried, and they should be. As governments change, and as governments change in this dramatic way with very differing worldviews, they are likely to be most affected. Many of them depend on America for many of these important national considerations, security, economics, and of course the voice and agency they have in international platforms. Now there are a second set of countries who actually are enjoying this. They are actually seeing this as a way of claiming the space that America is inadvertently vacating. So there are many who see this moment as a moment to actually claim those spaces, make themselves more heard, make themselves more integrated into communities that would have otherwise preferred to be somewhere else. So, and that's the second set of nations. The third, and I think those are possibly countries such as India, who are carving out new arrangements, who are building resilient mechanisms to manage the ebbs and flows of American politics. So you see a concerted effort by many of the emerging powers to actually not take sides or root for one particular outcome, but rather build your own capacities and capabilities and partnerships and friendships and alignments so that you can in many ways ride the storm. Now, India is perhaps one amongst a handful, and I'm being a little optimistic here, is amongst those rare countries who are impervious to regime change in America. If I could use that word that Americans used for third world countries in the last century. So when a regime change happens in America, we would largely be impervious because it is a broad-based relationship where you have both parties agree on at least the core of the relationship. Of course, the progressives have their own agendas, and the mercantilists have their own grouse with India. Both of them have some bits of grouses, but largely the trunk of the relationship has remained unchanged and has only grown and become stronger in the last 20 years across presidents, across prime ministers on both sides, right? And I think India would have to continue to focus on building the institutions that will drive the relationship forward and not necessarily worry about the politics that is going to be defining the sound bites. We have to work with the intelligence folks, the military folks, the business folks. We have to work with the regulators. We have to work with the green transitions folk. We have to navigate the IRA and its implications on us. We have to work with them on creating global governance for technology and AI and all other disruptive innovations that are happening. So I think our relationship is now far more nuanced and deeper than an election.
Ravi, in a very tight election, what do you think will ultimately decide whether Biden prevails or Trump?
Turnout, for one. Even in Iowa this past week, we saw extreme cold temperatures leading to a decline in turnout, which could have affected some of the other candidates. Not Trump, clearly, because a lot of his supporters are very motivated and care a lot about getting out and supporting him. But I think turnout will matter a lot. And remember, the American election process is very strange. You've got basically around 50,000 people in 4 odd states that are going to end up deciding this election. And so a lot will hinge on how they see the contrast between Trump and Biden in the weeks leading up to the election. For example, over the last few weeks, a lot of Democratic strategists have been very worried about polls suggesting that Arab Americans are unhappy with Biden because of the way in which America has handled the conflict in the Middle East. Now, for example, if you're in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a battleground state, that is going to affect Biden. The question is, 1 year from now, in this case, 10 months from now, are voters going to remember that? Are they going to focus on Gaza if you're Muslim American, or are they going to focus on the fact that the other guy, Trump, is a president who tried to enact a so-called Muslim ban? So the stakes, I think, both sides will be trying to make very clear the contrast between the candidates. And I think a lot will depend on the mood and the moment. For example, with the economy, experts now are quite sure that the economy is actually doing much better than people believe it is doing. And part of this is because economic indicators are a lagging indicator. But ultimately, you can't tell people what to feel. If people feel that inflation is biting them, you can't tell them otherwise. A lot will depend in the next few months whether wage inflation catches up with real inflation, whether people begin to believe that actually they are doing better than they were. Part of the problem here as well is this is not just about economics, it's about behavioral science. For example, if you get a 10% raise, but inflation is 9%, you believe that you deserved the 10% and you did not deserve the 9% inflation. So you're still going to complain about the price of bread and eggs being higher than they are because you like to complain about it. So Biden's going to have to battle all of those factors, incumbency, And of course, his age, concerns about that, although Trump is not that much younger.
So, what are you making of the fact that young Americans in the recent data seem to be suggesting that they like Trump?
It is worrying. And part of this, again, remember, for the last 8 odd years, all of us have kind of bored ourselves to death trying to examine and think backwards about why people voted for Trump. And we've gone through a cycle of various theories. The theories include that some Americans felt left behind. Some theories are about white supremacy. Some are about anti-globalization. Some are about anti-cosmopolitanism. Who knows what the exact reason is, but there is something. Something in America is broken in that there's a rising sense of distrust about so-called seemingly smug kind of Clinton-era strategists in D.C. There's a lot of disillusionment about the way in which government works, and there's a lot of polarization which comes in part from the way the media is set up in America. All of these forces are going to collide. I'll add one more, mis and disinformation. All of us are extremely worried about how that might play out in this election. It played out in the last 2 elections. You'll remember that there were fears that the Russians had tried to interfere in 2020 and before that. This time it's going to be worse. And here at Davos, a lot of us are talking about AI and how that might play a role in mis and disinformation, and Americans are extremely vulnerable to that, given the way in which the media ecosystem works there. So there are a lot of worries, there are a lot of concerns. We'll have to see how it plays out. But again, an extremely small number of people hold the fate of America and maybe even the world at some level, or at least multilateralism.
Let me just qualify that. A small number of people, all on TikTok, hold the future of America in their hands. It's amazing. They're a country so sophisticated in its technology prowess. America, it's the fountainhead of innovation. It's so meek and it's so naive in tech regulation that they're still debating whether TikTok is something that is good for America or bad for America. I mean, that's an aside.
Yeah.
But I think...
No, but when Trump won the first time, the sense outside was, okay, maybe post Barack Obama, a lot of Americans started feeling that he got left behind, and this is the pushback of middle America. What does it mean about America, in your view, if Trump were to win again, or at least, be on the ticket and make it a real tough election?
Look, I think Trump is an unusual candidate. He was the first American president who defeated 2 parties to win the presidency. Everyone normally fights from a party. He defeated the Republicans first, then he defeated the Democrats, and then he became president. So Trump is a cult by himself, and we have to understand that in a presidential form of government, we were always worried that we might have a runaway individual, and Trump is precisely that. So I think Trump represents a break from America's rather stable recent history of more than 100 years, where you have not witnessed a runaway train, such as what Donald Trump represents. Now, what does he fight on? He fights on exactly the same vulnerabilities and anxieties of people that folks around the world fight on. Now, what is that? It is not how you are doing. It is how someone else is doing, and are you doing worse off? And I think he fights on one, the comparative inequality in society, and not the overall lifting up of the economic situation of individuals, right? So, and he uses technology and digital media and of course imagery and typologies of the past to reinforce the point. Migrant is the problem if you're not doing well. Migration is the problem if you're not doing well. Communities, certain specific communities are the reason why you are in the state you are in. He is using a 20th century playbook in 21st century grammar, vocabulary and technology. There is nothing new about his campaign. What has changed is exactly what Ravi mentioned. The public sphere in America had ignored the half of America for the longest time. When things were going well, at the peak of Pax Americana, it was basically 25% of American elites who represented the Pax Americana. 75% were excluded from the press, were excluded from financial institutions, were excluded from economic mainstream programs. They were generally growing at a different speed, living in a different reality, and facing daily situations which were remarkably different to those in the coasts, West Coast and East Coast. America had a problem. America had a serious problem. It had a structural problem which has created a constituency that believes that it has no relationship whatsoever with what the Democratic Party today represents. Right? Guess what? In the most recent times, and this is the point Ravi was making, in the most recent times there's a breach in the Democratic Party itself. Now, you have the centrist of old, the Clintonians, and perhaps I would argue even the Biden format of governance, what he has shown in his first term, who are more center-left and who look at American force for the world being a force for good, who are internationalists by definition, who seek to do good as they assess it. I'm not saying they always end up doing it, but as they assess it. But they are generally folks who are what we would call the centrists, right? Now there's a breach in the Democratic Party. There are progressives who are sometimes as ridiculous as the Trumpians. You know, the extreme left of the Democratic Party and the right in American politics are both seemingly unrelatable to people who are sitting in different parts of the world, right? And those folks are perhaps the weakest link in Biden's re-election bid. Will they go out and vote for him? Because for him, Ukraine was peak American internationalism, and intervening for Israel and against Hamas is a failure of America. The same group, the same chunk which was celebrating intervention in Ukraine is the one that is bemoaning American intervention in the Middle East. How do they behave will decide what, because see, please understand, Trump starts with a 2% disadvantage. That is the way America is structured. Republicans don't have the numbers.
Adequate in the view of India and many other countries on Israel to now start pulling back on the hostilities in Gaza. Not that that's making any difference to Benjamin Netanyahu. There is the concern about a potential escalation with the Hezbollah and the Houthis, who continue to keep attacking shipping liners. So how do you see the situation play out from here?
I'm worried. I'm very concerned about how America is handling the crisis in the Middle East. You mentioned the Houthis. This week, America and UK forces have tried to bomb Houthi positions. The Houthis are defiant. They will escalate at some point, and they already have in attacking a US ship this week. Remember, part of the reason behind all of this is to free up the Red Sea to allow commercial vessels to go through, which has impacts on supply chains and insurance around the world. That hasn't changed. So there's still a lot of fear about a wider war. You mentioned Hezbollah. They haven't even entered the fray in a big way. If they do, this war becomes so much bigger, and America gets mired in a much more serious way. That is immensely concerning. I think, on October 8th, the day after Hamas's horrific attack on Israel, President Biden did the right thing. He decided to go to Israel. He decided to stand with Israel. But I think in the days since, as destruction in Gaza has continued, as the death toll has mounted, as we've learned more about what's happening there, and also the fact that Hamas is still operating. It's the notion that one could destroy this group, as Israel has claimed it wants to do, is a claim that beggars belief at this point. And so I think how quickly America can pivot, can add pressure on Israel, can force Israel to think about an endgame, that's going to be very important. And I think America maybe has miscalculated a little bit how much it is losing support in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, even among countries that are not part of any of those constituencies. India, for example. There's a divergence. The global south generally. There's also a divergence between America and Europe when it comes to how to act with Israel. So Biden has to step up. I mean, the thing is, he has all this leverage on Israel. The question is, when do you use that leverage?
Prime Minister Modi and Benjamin Netanyahu were very close. And now suddenly Netanyahu is persona non grata in Israel. People want him gone as soon as possible. And India has had a long-standing relationship with the people of Palestine and for the Palestinian cause. That puts a country like India in a very tricky situation, given what's playing out now and the fact that our shipping vessels also are being attacked by the Houthis.
So, Rahul, any country that has good ties and feels well for both sets of people, both sides of the conflict, Palestinian people, not the Hamas. Let's make a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people, and I think that is important. Every time we say Hamas, we tend to invisibilize the Palestinians who are actually the ones who are perhaps bearing the brunt of this conflict, and the Israeli people. And I think any country who feels well for both of these sets of people, the Palestinians and the Israelis, like India has always done, is going to be in a sticky place. Because, in some ways, if you were an evil planner in the Hamas wing of disruption and devastation, this is precisely the kind of response you would have hoped for, and the kind of the media imagery and the narrations that have emerged in the last few months. You would have actually wanted this kind of a global public outcry to bring this conflict center stage, to make it alive again. Remember, no one was talking about it. People were talking about a new Middle East. People were talking about connectivity. People were talking about the Abraham Accords. There were many who did not want this to happen. And if you were a planner and you wanted to disrupt all of this, this is exactly what you had wanted. So I think Hamas, in many ways, have succeeded in doing what they set out to do by bringing this whole old and historic dispute back at the heart of global discussions today. And I think that's an important element. But more importantly, they have also in many ways been able to galvanize the traditional non-aligned communities of the past, of the 20th century, into mobilizing against the Israeli nation, not against Netanyahu, against the Israeli nation. South Africa in the courts, for example, right? So, in many ways, they've also been able to tap into the 20th century collectives to come up and speak against Israel. And I think both of them hide, or rather are inadequate to come to, in some ways, an understanding of what is really happening. Yes, Netanyahu, by all accounts, is no longer the Netanyahu of many years ago. He has progressively chosen to stay relevant by changing his politics over time. It is his part of his political continuance, and I don't think India's relationship with Israel is about Netanyahu. India's relationship with Israel existed far before Netanyahu was the project Netanyahu was even conceived, right? So the idea that we have that India has a relationship which is somehow joined up with Netanyahu is wrong. We have a relationship with Israel which is independent of Netanyahu, and we have a position on Palestine that is time immemorial. In some ways, we always stood for it, and India is trying to make both of them happen against terror and for the Palestinian people. And we have to do both of it.
Let's spend a moment on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. President Vladimir Zelensky is at the World Economic Forum Congress Center at the moment. In fact, as I was coming up, I just bumped into him as he was walking in for his session. And the narrative at Davos seems to have changed on Ukraine. Last year, the question was, could there be a palace coup against Putin? Previously, the question was, how long will the war go on for? At one point in time, there was a question, can Putin and Russia lose? Now the question is, can Putin actually win? What's your sense?
Look, I think more than win or lose, this has been a conflict that, seems like it's going to go on for a while. And I think you have to think of it in terms of what changes the status quo, and at what point will the Ukrainians want to try and push for a settlement of sorts.
Putin doesn't want it.
Well, Putin actually privately has signaled that he would be willing to seek a settlement of sorts. And
wasn't that earlier when we didn't know as much as we do now, and the fact that maybe Trump wins in the US and Putin says, hey, I just need to hold on to November, and after that I could knock these guys out?
Yeah, that could well be the case. Putin is betting on Trump winning, for sure. Ukraine is betting on Biden winning, absolutely. So the stakes are clear there. I think both sides also will want to try and push for a settlement at a time when they are in the ascendancy. So, the timing is going to be very important for both sides. Ukraine has several milestones to look forward to this year. I mean, the spring and then summer and then winter counteroffensive didn't work out. It doesn't seem like they have the ammunition to push again for a counteroffensive until maybe 2025. So on Ukraine's point of view, this is going to be, mostly a defensive kind of maneuvering throughout 2024. But however, on the diplomatic front, they are trying to reorient some of their military supply chains through Europe rather than just depending on America. So they're very concerned about Trump, but they're also planning for a world in which Trump is president. Look out for the 75th anniversary of NATO, the big summit in June, where Ukraine is going to hopefully push for assurances and get them that it will eventually join NATO in 2 or 3 years. And those are all things that could lead to a pathway towards a settlement. And the reason why I say that is if NATO were to agree to create a pathway for Ukraine to join, then it would agree to defend the parts of Ukraine that Ukraine currently controls, so about 80% of the country, which would then mean that NATO has to defend those 80% sort of parts of territory that Ukraine does control. That'll be big. If that happens, we might have the beginnings of a settlement in 2024. That will likely take longer to work out, 25 or 26. But this is a war that will continue for a while.
What's your reading? How is this conflict likely to play out from here? And what does it mean for India?
Look, for us, I think we have to continue to be among those few voices which encourage early resolution or an off-ramp at least, even as we work on a resolution. So I think there are two parts to it. First, there has to be a working ceasefire. It could still be, it could still involve military build-ups on both sides, but let's try and get the fighting to stop. I think that's the first thing we need to look at. And then let's try to carve out something that is workable. If what Ravi was to say was to bear out, in some sense, 80% of Ukraine part of NATO, 20% as what I would call the safe zone between Russia and NATO, because that's what Russia's political anxiety is, to have NATO on its border, right? So Ukraine joining NATO was something that had terrified them. It's not going to change now. If they fought for it earlier, if they decided to step into Ukraine to fix that earlier, that is not going to go away. And Putin is standing for his own elections. He's probably regained his popularity. He's more popular today than he was 2 years ago. I think most folks would agree to that.
And there's no real way of knowing that. I mean, how do you know? There's no real polling in Russia about popularity.
Look,
I think in the polling, they don't really tell you what they think.
I think Rahul, sitting in Davos, the wind has affected you. Russia has the largest turnout of during its elections, and they do see voting. Now we could always look. I think you have to be fair here. They have large turnouts, and a large chunk of that turnouts votes in favor of Putin. I think that's a fact. Everything else is conjecture. I'm just telling you that. But it's also true that many American surveys that had polled that had asked the question about Russia's popularity 2 years ago versus more recently will tell you there's been a marked upswing in support he has. So I think his worst phase in this battle is behind him. He is far more confident of a new plan that had emerged post the early setbacks and by the way, they were not just early, they were long sustained setbacks for nearly 1 year. It was a tough 1 year for Russia. For a war that they considered to be over in 15 minutes, so they wanted it over in 15 days, was lasting many months. Sorry, I said years, I meant 15 days. Now, it was a long 1 year for them. It was a long winter for him. I think those days are behind them. I am not sure that he is waiting for Trump's election. I'm sure his plan is immune to American politics. Great powers make their own, and they certainly consider themselves as one. And they make their own assessments. I think Ravi is absolutely right. He would like a ceasefire when he believes he can negotiate a better outcome. And the NATO would want a ceasefire when they can negotiate a better outcome. Ukraine is not a player in this. Ukraine is the proxy used by a $40 trillion and a multi-country coalition that is negotiating the terms of Europe's future. It is now no longer about the conflict that started 2.5 years ago. Its resolution is about the clutch of EU 27 plus America and a few others. It's about the 30-odd countries sitting on one side with a $40 trillion GDP and a $2 trillion GDP sitting on the other side, negotiating the terms of resolution of Europe. So I don't think this battle is about. I think invoking Ukraine is not necessarily correct. It is a Western Europe America discussion with Russia on the future of Europe, and both sides would like to do this discussion on terms that benefit them. yes, Russia may believe that waiting a few months, holding out a few more days, might allow them to negotiate better terms. But I suspect both America and Russia are in conversations already. I don't suspect, I know they are. And they are talking to each other at various levels. And I don't think the Europeans are very excited about that. But I do know that at least the American security, intelligence and thinking community has been discussing the possible off-ramps, has also been throwing trial balloons through media and other discussion forums, is also reaching out to think tankers in Russia or academics in Russia to have conversations. There is an effort. I'm not sure in an election year the Americans can go beyond, can go the whole way in pushing this towards a certain direction, and I don't think Russia is harmed by waiting for it to get over, the elections to get over. It might result in an outcome that might be more favorable to them. So I think both of them cannot accelerate this before the elections in some sense, and one party gains either ways.
Sure, this has been a fascinating conversation. Lots of sharp insights there. Ravi Vagadal and Samir Saran. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Cheers.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe for multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and many other sectors.
Hello and welcome. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and with me is Bharat